Thank you, Barnes. My name is Jamela Alendogan. I'm the Foreign Correspondent Association of the Philippines President, and I'm the correspondent also of Al Jazeera English. Would like to say good morning and thank you everyone for joining us here. There is a lot to unpack today. The focus really is on the issue of what is happening, many things happening in the South China Sea, and the current impasse between China and the Philippines over Whitson Reef in the South China Sea amid the pandemic currently, obviously, that underscores the chronic tangle of threats, aggression, and national pride in the long feared flashpoint in Asia. A lot to unpack today. As I said, how has China's so-called gray zone strategy using China's militia fleets and now missile speedboats evolved and changed the security equation in the disputed waters? How will the Biden administration respond to this challenge? And what are the implications if the US, for example, presses on with a more active involvement? How will ASEAN and its code of conduct negotiations with China be impacted? FOCAP, many are asking too what's driving one of the most hyperactive responses of the Duterte administration, a new territorial flare-up, given its rapprochement and dependence on China for COVID-19 vaccines. FOCAP has invited three prominent experts today to speak on the dynamics and pitfalls of the latest saga. There is a lot to unpack, and we're very grateful to our speakers for finding the time to speak to us despite their busy schedule. Thayer of the University of New South Wales will be joining us from Canberra at the Australian Defence Force Academy. And of course, we have here, I believe for the first time, Dr. Collin Koh, who is a research fellow at the School of International Studies in Singapore, the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore. And he will also deliver a brief opening remark and then take questions from FOCAP and the Philippine media. Later on, Senator Hontiveros, who has a pending Senate resolutions on China's actions, will also join us to share her thoughts on how the current Philippine administration has dealt with China's actions. We'd like to remind everyone to keep their audio on mute unless it's their turn to speak and ask questions. We are live streamed on Facebook with hopefully live tweets on Twitter, but only questions from our Zoom participants will be entertained by the speakers. The first two questions, as mentioned earlier, will be from members of the foreign press, and then we'll open the floor to questions from the local media. Questions from the chat group can be read, but we encourage everyone to please ask the questions directly for a more dynamic discussion. One brief follow-up question will be allowed. Again, thank you so much for joining us here, and we'd like to give the spotlight, obviously, first to Collin, who is joining us as a speaker and guest for the first time. Collin, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Allow me to thank FOCAP for inviting me to speak at this forum. It's a very timely issue we are looking at, and I prefer probably we can later spend more time on the Q&A. I believe that is likely going to be the more fruitful part of the discussion. So just to give a brief opening, since Jamela, you talked about gray zone, and I think one thing is to set the context. Being a think tank analyst who looks at maritime issues, I think it is important to look at the concept of gray zone in a holistic manner. We're not just talking about gray zone that relates to the maritime domain. We are talking about gray zone writ large. In short, we are largely looking at what we call strategy short of war. That includes coercion at sea, as well as coercion using other non-militarized tools such as economic coercion. These all count under gray zone. If you look at what happened in Whitson Reef, for example, then this is one type of gray zone that potentially could mean the attempt by China to try to create a fait accompli that will likely push the victim, in this case the Philippines, towards a few limited courses of action. One is either inaction. If it's inaction, then very likely it plays right into the hands of everybody. In Beijing's point of view, that is basically getting a victory out of it because there's no response from the victim. Or the other course of action could be to precipitate an action by the victim that can potentially be seen as escalatory. Because when we talk about gray zone, it is also a contestation of the will and the mind. in that sense, because the assumption for the gray zone aggressor is the victim, for the purpose of not wanting to escalate the situation, may not want to overturn the fait accompli, thereby creating this situation where the status quo is revised and it is not overturned thereafter, and then it became a norm. So this is likely one of the scenarios that we are looking at Whitson Reef, and in that sense, it might potentially be similar as a potential repeat of what happened in Mischief Reef back in the 1990s, when first we saw just some very few Chinese vessels that are roaming around the area. Gradually the size increased, and then gradually the Chinese solidified their presence, and then we saw wooden structures being built, and then wooden structures graduated to become concrete structures, and then what we saw today is a full-fledged artificial island replete with airstrip, with ports, and we have Chinese military aircraft landing on Mischief Reef. And just late last month, pictures that were taken by the AFP patrol indicated three fast attack craft together with a tender from the PLA Navy that were parked in Mischief Reef. So, and then thereafter we had this incident that is probably linked to Whitson Reef, but it is seen as a broader part of what China is doing, which is the harassment of the TV crew near Second Thomas Shore. And that actually does relate to a much broader situation we are looking at, whereby China is actually evolving its approach in asserting its maritime sovereignty and rights in the South China Sea. We're not just looking at China using the militia or the Coast Guard, but we're also seeing a joint effort with the PLA Navy in concert, and that is within the Philippine EEZ. And of course, all these takes place in the context of COVID-19. And I wouldn't see Whitson Reef as an isolated case by itself, but it actually stems from a whole series of coercive instances that took place since late 2019 with Vanguard Bank in Vietnam, and in the early 2020, the North Natuna Sea standoff with Indonesia, and thereafter the West Capella incident with Malaysia, and right now what we have here in Whitson Reef. And the context this year is important to highlight is the 100-year anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party. And all these actions could be well seen as a way for Xi Jinping and the Communist Party to try to promote itself in the eyes of the domestic audience, given the fact that in 2012, when Xi Jinping came to power, he did emphasize, unlike his predecessors, very greatly on the idea of upholding China's maritime sovereignty and rights. So in preparation for the anniversary this year, I think all these actions are in as much intended for the promotion of core interests of China, but also for the promotion of the Communist Party in power. So with that, I think I might have exhausted enough time for the brief overview, and I very much welcome comments and questions from everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. We're still waiting for Carl to join, but just want to remind everyone, members of our colleagues in the media, that they can already line up for their turn to ask questions. You can just send us a message here on the chat group for everybody to see, and it will be we'll be doing it chronologically. And since no one's volunteered to ask questions, let me fire the first one to you, Colin. There, basically we've seen like almost 200 fishing vessels, supposedly fishing vessels at Whitson Reef, right? I mean, that was exposed to the public more than 2 weeks ago. But, according to security experts, these militia vessels who are believed to be really connected to the Chinese defense, for example, did not arrive all at the same time. They arrived in small batches. Why do you think, as these things were developing at Whitson Reef, that this was not exposed early on? That it took, a satellite similarity, I believe, a video to be seen before, for example, those who are in power actually, sent an alarm, and before this turned into a kind of verbal tussle between security officials. what was the silence about? If you have an assessment of that, please tell us.
Yeah, it's a very good question. It somewhat puzzled me as well because given the advent of source intelligence, commercial AIS tracker, for example, and not to mention real-time satellite images as well as other tools available to public, it is somewhat puzzling to find that all these things only came to light at least 2 weeks after the first instance was first recorded on the massing of the vessels. At the same time, I believe this is part and parcel of the entire strategy that could have been taken by China that could well explain that. I don't think we're seeing, a whole outright massing of those vessels at the first instance. I mean, it all started with only a few vessels that came to the area and they started to do reconnaissance of the area. This is basically how a maritime militia tends to behave. And they don't come in what we call reconnaissance in force. I mean, they don't come in hundreds of vessels. It could create undue alarm. They come with probably one or two of them, and they enter at very random periods of time to conduct their reconnaissance. And when they make sure that their movements are not that well monitored, thereafter they ramp up the presence gradually. So I think in some ways, most of us would have been pretty much focused on the key features in the South China Sea. For example, what happened around, say, Fiery Cross Reef, for example, Subi Reef, all those key artificial islands in the very recent years tend to be in the spotlight. And Whitson Reef, I mean, it sort of dropped off the radar for a long while, and it only re-emerged as one potential flashpoint just very recently, just early last month. So I wouldn't be surprised because there are many features out there that had not been paid that much equal attention so far. So in a way, not every open source intelligence outlets are looking at every places at the same time. So that probably explains why, that there's a sort of a delay in that. Yeah.
Why do you think the Whitson Reef is pretty strategic? I mean, why do you think, it is important for China, perhaps, and despite denials, basically that these are in any way sanctioned by the Chinese government, the fact that it takes a really long time before they leave may indicate that this has really clearance from Beijing. Why the Whitson Reef, and how strategic is the Whitson Reef? We know what happened in Scarborough Shoal in 2012, and there is an analysis that this may be a repeat of what happened to the Philippines with regards to the Scarborough Shoal. And this would be my last question, and we'll move on to Risa from the South China Morning Post.
Yeah, thank you. It is a very good question because if you look at the map itself, Whitson Reef is located almost in the midpoint between two established Chinese outposts out in the spread east. And the distance between the two outposts are pretty significant in a sense. And if we are talking about just simply using radar systems, sensors for coverage, it could have sufficed purely as a maritime domain awareness node. But if we talk about quick response in terms of intercepting any other foreign vessels in the vicinity of interest to China, having an outpost in Whitsun Reef might have potentially solved the problem. So I think that probably explains why Whitsun Reef has been regarded as strategic, and plus the fact that within Union Banks itself, there are established outposts, in particular from Vietnam. And it would have made sense for China to have one outpost close to Vietnam's and to keep tabs on those activities as well. So I believe what Whitsun Reef has in value is in terms of closing a gap between two established island outposts or artificial island outposts in the spread list.
Thank you, Collin. I will now call Risa Robles of the South China Morning Post.
Hello, good morning. Thank you very much, Dr. Koh, for coming in. I'd like to ask a very basic question. You mentioned that this year is the 100th year anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, please explain to us what is the role of the Chinese Communist Party in setting policies about the South China Sea? I know this is a very basic question, but I need to ask it. In the light of the fact that the PDP Laban ruling party has established formal links with the Chinese Communist Party. This is the first time ever that a political party in the Philippines has formal links with the Chinese Communist Party. And what are the implications of that fact that our very own ruling party has formal links and that there are, there is conflict in the South China Sea between the Philippines and China. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Risa. It's good to meet you online after we have sort of corresponded for a while. Thank you for a question. It is important to highlight here that most people may have the misconception that when it comes to the South China Sea, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs was the one that made decisions. That is not true. If anything, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs wasn't ranked as highly within the entire pecking order within the Chinese system. And even for Wang Yi as the foreign minister, he actually pales in comparison to the state councillor Yang Jiechi in a sense. So the Chinese Communist Party is the one that sets the decision within the Central Committee, and more importantly, within the Politburo and within the Politburo, within the small, very, very, very tight inner circle, which is a standing council within the Politburo, who made the key decisions when it comes to the South China Sea. And Raisa, you mentioned about those inter-party links between PDP Laban and the Chinese Communist Party, and that probably created questions about why the Chinese will resort to this when there are actually presumably close interactions between the two parties. I could draw attention to Vietnam's example. The Vietnam Communist Party is considered a fraternal brother of the Chinese Communist Party for historical reasons. And for a long while, even to this day, even China is considered a traditional friend of Vietnam from the party point of view, but it didn't stop China from time to time, exercising coercion against Vietnam. The only thing that comes out of this sort of relationship is that whenever all these incidents happen, there is a ready communication channel between those two communist parties to iron out things. A good example would be what happened in 2014 over the oil rig Haiyang Shiyu 981. That was resolved largely because of back channel diplomacy between the two parties, despite the fact that officially they cut off their official exchanges. And that also applies to the Vanguard Bank incident, where back channel diplomacy between the two parties worked the magic. So in this case, I wouldn't be surprised that due to the fact that there is no clear affinity between PDP Laban and the Chinese Communist Party, even in terms of ideology. And this inter-party relationship, from my point of view, wouldn't be as significant insofar that it only works when it comes to crisis communication in terms of trying to de-escalate situation, then probably it works in that way. But it wouldn't stop China from exercising what it's doing in the South China Sea, despite those links. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Collin. Do you have a follow-up question, Risa?
Yes. It's very interesting that before the Whitson Reef came about or came to our attention, the Chinese embassy in Manila had actually posted a photo from a Zoom forum between the PDP Laban President Manny Pacquiao and the Chinese, some officials of the Chinese Communist Party. What I would like to ask you then is, seeing that Manny Pacquiao is the acting president of PDP Laban, and you said that the links could be used as a form of crisis communications, then is it possible that actually PDP Laban, Manny Pacquiao, using his office and using his fame as a world boxing champion, could actually persuade China to do something about Whitson Reef?
Mm.
Dr. Collin, before you briefly answer that, I just want to quickly welcome Carl Thayer, who's already here
Yep.
joining us. Good morning. And also Senator Risa Hontiveros just joined us today. After Colin answers that question, we'll quickly move to Carl and Senator Risa Hontiveros before we go back to questions back to Carl. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Risa. I'll be quick before we move on to Carl and Senator Risa. Now, it's possible that there would be the possibility of these communication of trying to sort of ask or persuade China to roll back on its activities. All these are possible, and in fact, this back channel diplomacy would have been no different from what we see in the case of Vietnam and China, with the exception that not all the time Vietnam will publicize these sort of interactions. On the other hand, I think it's important to note that I believe China does have next year's Philippine presidential election in mind. I think that's an important context to consider, because I think China will be very interested to find out whether there will be continuity in terms of the Philippine policy towards the South China Sea after next year's election, and it won't be surprising that there's already all these efforts undertaking to try to cultivate friends, if I could put it bluntly, in preparation for next year. So that is all part of the communication strategy, I believe, and certainly using this PDP-Laban CCP linkage could help in persuading Beijing, but I'm not so sure to what extent it will, except the fact that next year's election could be a very good bargaining chip in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you. Carl, good morning.
Morning.
It's nice to see you again. We'll just put you on slide. Please hold.
Okay, I notice I'm screen sharing. Can you see me now?
Yes, we can. We can see you very well. So
I apologize to your guest, and I have an appointment, so I've got 20 minutes total that I can be with you, I think, now. I prepared some PowerPoints. I've sent them to Jim Gomez. They can be distributed. I want to talk about the strategic context of China's maritime presence at Whitson Reef. And I begin with five main areas. And the first is to look at the Biden administration and what it says about China in its interim national security strategy guidance. Is that China is becoming more assertive. It's the only competitor potentially capable of combining economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to mount a sustained challenge to a stable and open international system. And in response to that, the strategy says the U.S. has got to restore its credibility and global leadership to ensure that America, not China, sets the international agenda, working with its allies and partners. And continuing on with the strategic guidance, revitalizing our core strengths, that's including democracy in America and in the economy, is necessary but not sufficient. When China behaves aggressively and coercively and undermines rules and values of an open and stable international system, we, the United States, will answer China's challenge. Strategic competition does not, however, and should not preclude working with China when it's in our national interest. So that's the big picture with US and China. Now to focus in on the Indo-Pacific. The US will, and the Philippines comes in, as you can read between the lines, the US will reinvigorate and modernize our alliances and partnerships around the world. Democratic alliances enable the US to present a common front, a unified position, pool our strength to hold China to account. The US will modernize alliances and partnerships with Australia, Japan, and the Republic of Korea. And Philippines is not mentioned in the strategic guidance, but more on that in a moment. Vital national interests compel the deepest connection of the US to the Indo-Pacific, and it would engage partners, and it mentions India, Singapore, Vietnam, and members of ASEAN. But to continue, it's the force posture statement of the Indo-Pacific Command by Admiral Philip Davidson in March that gets us to the sharp end of the spear. He says in 2019, he made the assessment that the US had lost its quantitative advantage, more Chinese ships and airplanes than the US had, and the US qualitative advantage was shrinking across several domains as the People's Liberation Army fields higher quality systems. And he now in his testimony in March, the greatest danger for the US is the erosion of its combat credible conventional deterrence towards China. And without this credible deterrence, China will be emboldened to undermine international order and US values for a free and open Indo-Pacific. Nonetheless, the Indo-Pacific, according to Admiral Davidson, remains the priority for the Department of Defense. So my third area is the role of the Philippines. And here a credible deterrence comes in. Without getting into the technical details, and because I can't be with you for the whole thing, Collin is very well qualified to fill in the details, but it advocates an agile and distributed joint force, two military services, Air Force and Navy, or Marines and Navy, to deter and deny an adversary's objectives in the first and second island chain, those that extend from the first chain, Japan, down to Okinawa and the Philippines. And it's to regain a positional advantage by balancing key capabilities across the Indo-Pacific. And we just look at Southeast Asia here. And create a network of interoperable allies and partners willing and able to protect their sovereignty from coercion. And to reassure allies and partner of US capacity to conduct complex operation with classified capabilities, to let the allies be reassured that the US can gain a decisive advantage. So shoot and scoot, long-range precision strike missiles distributed across the region. The Philippines would be the centerpiece of that, forming the eastern flank of the South China Sea, in my opinion. Now, the role of the Philippines emerges in this force posture in a whole paragraph. The Philippines is called a strategic treaty ally and partner. And this force posture statement says that the Philippines' decision to temporarily suspend the termination of the visiting force agreement presents opportunities to address mutual concerns and reinvigorate joint and interoperability training opportunities as we seek a full reversal of the US of the termination process of the visiting forces agreement. And then that would facilitate deeper military cooperation and integration. It says the armed forces of the Philippines is committed to investing in high quality US defense equipment as they modernize their forces, and to conclude a general security and military information agreement with the United States. So with that, as I now hone in on China's pushback and assertiveness. China can see the strategy being unfolded. The Biden administration has considered the freedom of navigation operational patrols, the separate naval presence patrols, the flight of strategic bombers from continental United States, upped aerial reconnaissance. It's brought in carrier strike groups, and they have combined into a carrier strike force on occasion. Now the Theodore Roosevelt carrier strike group is operating. Allies have begun to make an increased appearance. Their warships, Japan, Australia, Canada, France, United Kingdom, and Germany, Netherlands, and they are or will be deploying in the South China Sea for exercises. Even prior to Biden coming in, the Trump administration had set up with China an action-reaction cycle. Whatever one side did, China would push back, the US would flex its muscles, China would push back. So we're seeing counter People's Liberation Army Navy deployments to what the Biden administration is sailing through the South China Sea. So the arrival of China's maritime militia and fishing fleet at Whitson Reef, in my opinion, is designed to put pressure on Duterte, who equivocates on whether or not he's going to terminate the visiting forces agreement, to disrupt any possibility of getting the US alliance with the Philippines reinvigorated, and demonstrate that the US has no strategy that would alter the status quo. So let me conclude. I see heightened tensions on the horizon is inevitable from this process of action-reaction. The military balance in the Indo-Pacific is becoming more unfavorable to the US, and that raises the risk that China will become emboldened to alter the status quo. That's an assessment by the US government. We can see this around by Chinese operations, not just confronting Taiwan, but around Taiwan and in the South China Sea. The Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy will lead to more frequent air and sea encounters with China. And regional states, both allies and partners, the Philippines, will come under increased US and Chinese pressure to take sides as these tensions heighten. That's it in a nutshell.
Thank you, Carl. Quickly, I know you have to go in about 5 minutes. Are you able to answer one question?
Yeah, I've set an alarm here. If it goes off, that's the
Okay,
warning.
great. All right. I'll ask a question for you. Given the fact that the tribunal has clarified the disputes in the South China Sea, especially in terms of the character of the geological features, how do you think should ASEAN and the rest of the international community make use of the ruling in terms of moving forward? How can ASEAN and perhaps the international community move forward using the ruling as a strategic platform in the South China Sea? And how do you think this can all be worked on for its enforcement?
Well, what I have to do is start off saying I have to disagree with the premise. In other words, that when ASEAN and China came up with guidelines to implement the DOC and then set up a working group to begin to negotiate the code of conduct, there were some over 15 amendments made over a period of 6 years. And in the end, only one major change was made, and ASEAN, which began saying it would meet first as a group and talk to China, gave that away and said it would merely promote dialogue. So we have now with the draft code of conduct, 2 countries, Laos and Myanmar, didn't submit. So it's 8 ASEAN countries plus China, that's 9. They've all shoved their submissions into this draft code of conduct. They've only been through 1 of 3 readings, the 3-year time limit that China sets about to expire. And in that are areas where, in terms of environmental protection, that's included in the code of conduct, but it doesn't specify the geographic area. It doesn't specify its legal status, a treaty or another political definition. It doesn't say anything about third parties. China doesn't want them to be involved in resource exploration or other resources. We see individual ASEAN countries from late last year following Malaysia's claim for an extended continental shelf, tabling their own submissions, calling out China's illegality, the illegality of China's claims to Shah, the 4 Shahs, or unified island features, and calling all the waters inside internal waters themselves. So, but we don't have an ASEAN front, united front on that. In any country, Cambodia can upset that. We're faced with Brunei, which I see as a reactive chairman, not proactive. And then if you follow alphabetically, we go on to Cambodia, which will be a non-actor. So in other words, there's no enforcement mechanism about the arbitral ruling. And 2, it operated under UNCLOS. UNCLOS, as everybody knows, does not resolve sovereignty disputes. It resolves claims to maritime zones. So we're stuck, to me, and I end on this, what I call, when I'm lecturing, I call the absurdity. If you have a narrow area for the code of conduct, that means you have to behave inside that. But once you sail 1 nautical mile outside, you can bash, destroy the environment, or do whatever you want because the code doesn't cover it. And that's why long ago I said it needs to be a Southeast Asia code of conduct for all the maritime waters of Southeast Asia as a group to give everybody a stake in that. So there's no common ground, unfortunately. And so your question, wouldn't it be nice if all 10 ASEAN countries could get together at the table? We see 2 that aren't interested. Cambodia, that continues to act as China's stalking horse, and certain countries in Brunei wanting to be reactive rather than proactive, which means China can steal a march before ASEAN can do anything about it.
Great, thank you. Last question. We have 3 minutes. We want to maximize this before we move to Senator Risa. talk to us about what you think about the current new seen as rivalry between the Quad versus China. I mean, we're talking about Quad, Japan, Australia, India, and the US, and how can ASEAN actually be involved? And they're talking about Quad Plus. So talk to us about this, dynamic between other countries who are not particularly part of the South China Sea, taking a more active role in the area, in the dispute.
Well, the Quad has not touched military.
Mhm.
It's just stayed shy of that. One, it will be greater coordination among its four key players. They will be able to coordinate the other elements of national power, diplomacy, politics, soft power that the Trump administration wouldn't touch. So that's good. They've chosen COVID virus and the COVID vaccine, I should say, and that was good because with the Philippines now seeing 50% efficacy and supplies, wouldn't it be nice if India could manufacture 1 billion? Unfortunately, India's just stopped all exports because it needs it at home, and Australia fly them around. So one, there would be an alternate. Two, prior to all that first virtual summit, there was rearrangement of financial institutions in three of the countries, at least, to provide funding for quality infrastructure and offer countries an alternative. So the Quad can begin to meld the direction. But when we look at the outcome, they set up three working groups, one on COVID, vaccines, one on emerging technology. And at the moment, off the top of my head, the third one was the second one. I can't think of it, but it was one of these non-military areas. So we can expect the Quad to play a military role. And and although there are differences on that, we can see a better coordination of diplomacy, politics, economics in the mix. And that's better because after 4 years of Trump, we didn't have bringing that together. So that's a positive thing for the Quad.
Thank you so much, Carl. Thank you for joining us once again. I know that you have a meeting within the next I guess, 30 seconds. You will have to leave now. So again, we want to thank you for always being generous with your time and sharing us what you think and your analysis about what is happening in the South China Sea. We really appreciate it. And again, thank you so much.
Yeah, my alarm's gone off, and I appreciate that, and I apologize, but it's
okay. I understand you have a.
I'm meeting with a head of a diplomatic mission and his staff, who all of a sudden changed the date after I'd just thrown out that, oh yeah, I'd be available on either the 12th or the 13th. And by the time you guys got back to me, this luncheon had been arranged, and it's a country vitally at the heart of what we're talking about. So.
Thank you, Carl. I believe you also have a PowerPoint presentation, which you'll just share with us. We'll share it with everybody.
Yes, Jim Gomez, I sent him a copy, and that can be used. That's what I've read from.
Thank you so much, Carl. You take care. Stay safe. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. And now I know there's quite a lineup of questions at the moment. We'd like to first welcome Senator Risa Hontiveros. Before we continue with questions, I believe Senator Risa has a brief opening statement as well before we continue with our discussions. We'll wait to get Senator Risa lined up. Good morning, ma'am.
Good umaga, Jamela. Yes, brief, I promise. 6 minutes about. Okay. With apologies for being late and gratitude for allowing me to still participate in this forum. Magandang umaga po sa inyong lahat. Good morning. Just earlier, Professor Carl, Thayer, Dr. Collin Koh, and all dear colleagues. I'm deeply indebted to the Foreign Correspondents Association of the Philippines for providing this panel with a forum to tell the world of the dangers posed by increasingly aggressive Chinese territorial expansion in the West Philippine Sea at the expense, unfortunately, of my country, the Philippines, and our peoples. This territorial dispute in a regional flashpoint threatens to draw the whole world into a wider conflict. I am also outraged and indignant at the deliberate, reckless, and unlawful campaign of the Chinese government to use its military and economic might to deprive the Filipino people of the full use of the waters comprising the country's exclusive economic zone and continental shelf. The recent conduct of the Chinese Coast Guard, as well as the People's Liberation Army Navy or PLAN, makes it clear that our freedom of navigation within our own waters has been severely impaired. China has not only excluded Filipino fisherfolk from their traditional fishing grounds in the West Philippine Sea, but also impeded the peaceful transit of a Philippine vessel in the country's own EEZ. 2021 was supposed to be a year of recovery, an opportunity to rebuild after the personal and economic traumas caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Instead, the country confronts a Chinese government seemingly intent on undermining Philippine sovereignty in the West Philippine Sea at every turn. Earlier this year, China passed a law authorizing its Coast Guard to use deadly force on foreign vessels within the so-called nine-dash line, a territorial claim that the International Court of Arbitration has already held to be without legal or historical basis. Last March, over 200 vessels of China's maritime militia gathered at Julian Felipe Reef in the West Philippine Sea, an area clearly within the Philippines' EEZ. The Chinese claimed their maritime militia was there to take shelter from inclement weather, but Philippine authorities said there was no storm. Now China claims Julian Felipe Reef is Chinese territory. When will the lies, deception, and hypocrisy stop? Their gray zone strategy in the WPS is premised on pursuing military and strategic objectives through using ostensibly civilian assets and enforcement methods. The Chinese government thinks it is being subtle and clever, but the only thing it is doing is showing the world that China cannot be trusted. Having snuck into our backyard like the proverbial thief in the night, China seeks to consolidate its occupation of Philippine waters by force. This April, a Chinese Coast Guard vessel and a planned missile boat impeded a Philippine vessel from exercising the freedom of navigation guaranteed by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, within our country's very own EEZ. This is a direct challenge to the international rules-based order that has maintained stability in the region for so long. And the use of a planned missile boat to shadow the Philippine vessel back to the Philippine coast signals a willingness to escalate the conflict with naval assets. The Chinese like to tell others to refrain from irresponsible behavior, but their recent behavior has been far from honest or responsible. The Chinese like to tell others to avoid actions that threaten bilateral relations, as well as the peace and stability of the region. But it is Chinese greed for territory, power, and hegemony that threatens to suck the world into a regional conflict. To convince us of its good intentions, China has given us its vaccines, possibly for free, or perhaps, as many people fear, in exchange for our waters. As I've said in previous statements, we must not allow China to shake our hands on vaccines and procurement, but stab us in the back on the West Philippine Sea. But Malacanang has tolerated China's duplicitous strategy. Malacanang, even after the most recent incident in Ayungin Shoal, likes to call China our friend, likes to talk about our special friendship with China. But this isn't how a friend treats you. This isn't even the act of a good neighbor. This is how imperialists have treated their vassals and client states since time immemorial. By talking about this so-called special friendship, the palace is telegraphing its incapacity or unwillingness to defy Beijing, further emboldening the latter's imperial ambitions. Moreover, by letting Beijing demean and abuse our country, the president is only signaling that we are weak, that we will not stand up for ourselves and our interests. China is the bully pretending to be your best friend, and bullies feed off weakness and insecurity. It's time to say enough is enough. There is another way. Indonesia has been able to acquire COVID-19 vaccines and Chinese investments while resisting Chinese encroachments into its territory. So we know there are limits to Chinese recklessness and adventurism. Our government must rethink its current alliances and perhaps its allegiances. We must be consistent and firm in standing up for our national interests. We should hold China accountable for the damage she has done to fragile marine ecosystems within our EEZ. We should ensure that our environmental laws, and not China's, are the laws being implemented and enforced in the WPS. At the Senate, I've filed Senate resolutions to address China's construction of artificial islands and to demand compensation from China for the ecological damage caused by her artificial islands. I intend to make these resolutions a priority once the Senate resumes its sessions in May. As our Departments of National Defense and Foreign Affairs pursue diplomatic initiatives, immediate action is also necessary. The Navy and Coast Guard should escort our fisherfolk to ensure that they have access to their primary and perhaps only means of subsistence. We cannot allow ourselves to be kicked out of our own backyard. The West Philippine Sea is part of the patrimony of the Filipino people. Above and beyond considerations of access to resources, diplomacy, and geopolitics, our national dignity is at stake. We Filipinos must not bend the knee to yet another imperial master. We must not cower in fear and submission. We must uphold the strength and courage of our nation. Marami pong salamat. Thank you very much.
Senator Risa, thank you so much for that very passionate speech. And we really hope to hear more from you later on as questions come in. We will now again go back to Collin. Collin, thank you so much for being here still, and we'll allow Dreo to ask the next question. I think Dreo, forgive me, I think you're from GMA. Yeah, am I correct? Dreo Alonso.
From Bloomberg. I'm from Bloomberg.
Sorry. Good morning.
It's okay. Hi, good morning to our speakers. Thank you for taking time with us. I'd like to just maybe expand what Senator Risa ended with. She already mentioned some of the concrete steps that the Philippines should take, like the Coast Guard and Navy escorting fisher folk. So maybe to Sir Collin, do you think this is doable? How will China react if we will send our own Navy ships there? Also, if there are any other concrete steps that you think we should undertake to be able to respond appropriately, of course, perfect world or in the ideal world, to China's actions, and also how do you think should the U.S. react? There was Sir Carl mentioned a while ago that there's no strategy to change the status quo, but do you agree with that? And if not, what should the U.S. do? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jill, for the question. And you reminded me of a number of years back when the Philippines was trying to convoy resupplies over to the second Thomas Shaw. And, you know, some of those early convoys were being blocked by the Chinese Coast Guard back then. But at one instance, subsequently, the Chinese Coast Guard backed off and the resupply got in to second Thomas Shaw. And one reason that could be attributed to had been because the Americans were patrolling in the air above the area, capturing evidences, providing some very crucial information gathering. And I think that is one way to deal with it. I think to deal with gray zone activities like this, it's important to let the aggressor aware that attempts undertaken to capture evidence that could be used subsequently for any follow-on political or legal recourse to get compensation or to let the world know what's going on. I think having it being publicized is important. That is one. And second is, given the fact that the Philippine Maritime Forces still face difficulties and challenges in terms of capacity and the requisite capabilities, I think it is undeniable that at a certain point of time, American support will be vital. And we're not probably talking about the Americans providing the escorts themselves, but providing air cover, providing maritime domain awareness data, and having an asset, looking around somewhere could actually be, a good way to remind the Chinese that there will be potential consequences if they escalate. The last thing I want to add is the Coast Guard law, which could be one area of concern. So it basically gives the victims, like the Philippines, a second thought as to whether there's a need to escalate that could risk, a retaliation from China. I think that is the part of the game for psychological deterrence, right? What I tend to see is the Coast Guard law isn't about changing Chinese behavior so much as changing the other people's behavior and trying to shape the behavior that suits Chinese interests. If the whole end game is that the victim is not going to act, then it is even better in that sense. So I think this is the way I would look at the situation confronting us right now.
I just have a follow-up question.
Yes, of
Yeah.
course. Go ahead.
Okay, this is for both Senator Risa and Mr. Collin. I'm just looking ahead, so to 2022. So how important is that election, that change in leadership or no change in leadership, if there will not be one, to all of these? And what do you think will Duterte do in his remaining years to address the issue, and what should his successor do to address the situation, if at all he or she can do anything? So maybe Senator Risa first, and then Mr. Collin.
Salamat, Dreo. Thank you. Unfortunately, up to this point in time, Malacanang has behaved largely, I'm sorry to say, like a doormat to China on this issue. And it has failed to stand up to China or to lead our people in standing up to China. And I don't see any indications from the president at this point in time that he has any intention of um, um, balancing or softening or altering his pivot towards Beijing in the last half decade. I'm just grateful that Secretaries Lorenzana and Locsin have spoken up somehow in contradistinction to the line carried by the president up to that point in time, even referencing what the administration had been silent on for the last 5 years, even referencing our historic victory at the Hague. Surveys would also show, at least until late last year, that however, among Filipino citizens, meaning the Filipino voters, that this matter of our national sovereignty in the West Philippine Sea has a quite high importance, and that a majority of Filipinos desire that we stand up for our national interest in the oceans, including vis-a-vis China. So I hope that that will be one signal for Filipino voters to demand a debate on this issue during the campaign, and that it will be something that will shape our electoral behavior come May 2022. And I hope that if we can come up with a better outcome overall, including on what mandate the Filipino citizens and voters will give to a new administration, that it will signal a more self-respecting, proactive, and effective foreign affairs or foreign relations stance of the next Philippine government. Lastly, could I also add, Dreo, before Dr. Collin, that in fact, elements of the armed forces also support a tougher stance in our oceans vis-a-vis China. And I welcome that very much also and support it. Salamat.
Yeah. Thank you, Jill. I believe I wouldn't have more of the value to add to what Senator Risa has said, but I just want to put in my observation as an outsider looking at the Philippine domestic politics. It was interesting because very often we see a disconnect in the public survey. On the one hand, there has been, a consistently poor public perception towards China, but on the other hand, there has been a consistently high approval rating for President Duterte, right? And I'm not so sure whether this particular result could have actually shaped the current administration's approach to China. I mean, the fact that President Duterte enjoys his personal popularity could have be seen as a permission given to him to pursue policies that he sees fit in dealing with China, since after all, he is considered as a chief architect of foreign policy in the Philippines, as what was mentioned from time to time by his spokesperson. And even, in that regard, sometimes contradicting what his secretaries in the cabinet were saying. I think it is not just about how the president reacts. I mean, the way I see it, having observed what is going on, is I think there is a lack of consistency and coherence in terms of strategic communication, which Senator Risa, you mentioned earlier, that on the one hand, we have the secretary saying, a set of remarks to China, but, all these could be nullified by the fact that the president comes in with a softer tone and it nullifies the effect of it. If there has been some consistency between the palace and the secretaries and the rest of the government agencies, and there is a coherent statement that comes out, it could have a much greater impact on what China is doing. I mean, I would see this as something that will stand very firmly established, irrespective of who becomes the president, if this has been a policy going forward. Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. Thank you, Dre. We now move, allow Melo Acuna, who is also a FOCAP
Yeah, good morning.
board member, to ask the question.
Yeah, good morning, Jam. My questions are for the good senator and for our guest from abroad. Looking at what's going on in the South China Sea or West Philippine Sea, uh, how relevant would the Association of Southeast Asian Nations be? If it is not at all relevant, would you rather have it dissolved? Can we have the thoughts of the good senator, please?
Thank you, Melo. Um, um, it is potentially relevant. I say that with all earnestness and hope. I think after fixing our own internal household, for example, moving towards the coherent strategic communication that Dr. Koh mentioned, our first backyard or neighborhood is the ASEAN. We must build and strengthen our alliances with countries, first of all, in the ASEAN. It's and coming together on a common position on how to proactively, effectively, and peacefully, as far as we can, but proactively and effectively engage China and make her behave in our region in a based on a rules-based order, including exploring further the code of conduct that Professor Carl was also talking about. We may need to, and I have appealed to the Secretary of Foreign Affairs to push this. We will need to set aside the traditional consensus building only process, which unfortunately sometimes has become an excuse for not doing enough that the combined political muscle of the different ASEAN member countries could otherwise accomplish, and move towards a more democratic majority rules decision-making process, if possible, so as to enable the stronger voices already in ASEAN, like Vietnam, Indonesia, and a few others, to be able to galvanize the other ASEAN member countries to take that stronger, more proactive and effective stance, and not be held hostage or vetoed by a fewer number of the ASEAN member countries, although everyone, of course, will have their say in the consultation. Because if we can come up with a common position within the ASEAN, then I think we will be better able to engage China in a second round of dialogue. Then also we must engage in the Indo-Pacific region. So the Quad is very important to engage. But first, after doing our own homework, fulfilling our own responsibilities, not expecting the Quad, not expecting the US or any other of the naval powers to, as it were, fight a proxy war for us. No, we have to come to the table first as the Philippines and then as a member country of the ASEAN within the ASEAN. Then we will have all the more right or face, speaking as an Asian, to say to the Quad, please do support us politically, diplomatically, economically, environmentally, and then strengthen our alliances with all the other countries in the world that also want to maintain peace, a just peace, a peace based on everybody following rules, no matter how large or small, how powerful or less powerful, how rich or less rich. That collective power of the majority in all of these communities we are part of will be the key to contain China and to make her behave.
Yes. Yes, Dr. Collin, please.
Thank you. I fully agree with what Senator Risa has said, and I just want to sort of add further. I think there is one structural issue that we face in the long term is a more or less disunited ASEAN, even though the end state that we should be working towards is, all 10 ASEAN countries eventually coming together. But if we try to envision the roadmap forward, we can see in phases. I think the first phase, I believe, is for ASEAN countries, especially South China Sea parties, to resolve amongst themselves their bilateral issues. And in this case, I would envision Indonesia and Vietnam resolving their EEZ boundary issue in the South China Sea. I think we are seeing right now some optimistic signs of that happening, because between Malaysia and Vietnam, they are going to sign an MOU on maritime security cooperation that could allow them to resolve the issue of Vietnamese fishery encroachment in Malaysia. This sort of intra-ASEAN resolution of their problems is going to help in promoting, the solidarity between ASEAN countries to deal better with China. Because so far, we talk about the code of conduct. The ideal end state is a one-to-one negotiation. Maybe what I mean is between ASEAN and China. But what we are still settled with is 10 against 1. And that is precisely the sort of situation that benefits Beijing, because it's easy to divide and conquer. But be that as it may, if we can't reach a 1-versus-1 scenario for the code of conduct negotiation, I think a best outcome we can think about is to have ASEAN countries who are like-minded to band together, to have a common position instead of waiting for the entire ASEAN to come to that. And I would see that as applying not just to claimant countries, but also non-claimant ASEAN countries that are interested in the South China Sea peace and stability. So having a coalition of the willing amongst ASEAN countries might potentially convince the outliers like Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar to think twice about staying aloof to the South China Sea issues and only thinking just about their economic interests with China. And for a time, finally hoping that they could, bring ASEAN interests into play for once. So this is one way we can think about, going forward. And second, I thought would be an interesting point, since we are on it, is I think ASEAN countries collectively and individually needs to diversify their economic reliance. It's not just on China. I mean, China has been a vast market for, exports, and it is a good source of investments. But I think it is time for ASEAN countries individually and together to think about how best to diversify abroad beyond China in terms of supply chain, in terms of export market, in terms of investments. And that's why Senator Risa talks about, broadening ties with, the Quad, and broadening ties with the international community is a relevant statement to make. Thank you.
Yes, just a brief follow-up. Where would the Philippines be with China and the US pursuing their own geopolitical agenda, because it's been said, it's an Asian proverb that when buffaloes fight, it's the small grass that tend to suffer. So where will we be? We cannot move our country away from where we are. Your thoughts, please. Thank you. Yes, Madam Senator, your thoughts, please.
Yes, Sir Melo. So the grass must band together, as Dr. Collin also said. We cannot move away from our place in the ocean. We don't want to move away. China will always be our bigger, possibly more powerful, richer neighbor. But together, as grass, so first of all, we have to come up with a more proper and self-respecting position as a country led by government, but also together with the civil society and eventually the private sector, to the point that Dr. Collin made about diversifying our economic engagements globally. And then we must band together. I've been taking notes from Dr. Collin. Band together first with like-minded countries in the ASEAN, and then eventually, hopefully, let's work for that within the ASEAN to engage China, and then to engage also with the Quad and the other naval powers um, around the world. There will always be those hippopotamus or large mammals or on land or in the ocean. But in order to avoid having to choose merely between two sides, as Professor Carl was also talking about earlier, then we have to form our own third front or coastline or third pole, with all self-respect, joining our smaller capacities together to engage this regional power, rising global power, the way many of us have engaged other global powers before. And lastly, if we're going to be grass, then let's be bamboo, which can whip those buffaloes.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Next question will be coming from Cedric of GMA 7. Cedric.
Yes, good morning. Can you hear me?
Can hear you.
Yeah, Madam Senator, I'm sorry I cannot be on video right now because it's not working. My questions are for both resource persons, and this is quite similar to Dreo's previous questions. So, given the results of the 2016 and 2019 elections, what is the likelihood of these territorial disputes to be core narrative for the 2022 elections among the country's poor majority? And as my follow-up, how do we explain the high approval rating of the president versus the very popular sentiment among the people, Filipino people, to insist on our rights over the territory?
Dr. Collin, would you like to go ahead this time?
Well, this is a very interesting question, and as I mentioned earlier, Cedric, it sort of intrigued me that there has always been the disconnect in perception. On the one hand, personal popularity of President Duterte and the general negative perception towards China, and the fact that it's not just in the Philippines actually, but if you look at it, even in Malaysia, for example, in Indonesia, most of the time voting might not have been predicated on sovereignty concerns. I mean, it has largely been on concerns that concerns really, social economic well-being. And my concern is going forward. I'm not trying to sort of gaze at the crystal ball for the 2020 next year's election, but the way I look at it is with the current pandemic and the focus on economic recovery, will economic imperatives again, overshadow the concerns related to sovereignty, and will that thereby, get into the hands of, the powers to be in that sense? So I think there's a lot of uncertainty over here, and if China plays its cards correctly, then it will try to de-escalate from Whitson Reef, and to hope that for the rest of the year leading up to the to next year's election, then it will not try to do anything that could potentially damage whoever party that it supports to continue the current policy on the South China Sea. So I think we are seeing a lot of uncertainty so far going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Cedric. I'm also hard put to explain the gravity-defying alleged popularity of the president if we are to base it on the survey results. Although I do recall there was, for example, one former US president who was called the Teflon president, maybe for different reasons. And I've heard that tag also being stuck on our president now. But nonetheless, in relation to one of the points raised by Dr. Collin, definitely health and the economy are now and will remain decisive issues in the minds, in the lives and experiences of Filipinos, leading all the way up to the campaign and the elections next year. And in fact, I think at least one of these factors is also perhaps being managed or instrumentalized by the administration as part of their plans for the campaign and the election. But even if it would come in third, I think an important third would be this China factor. And if we think of China as a factor, she also factors into Filipinos' gut or pocketbook concerns about health and the economy because of her vaccine diplomacy, because of the heavy-handed way in which the administration tried to strong-arm preference for Chinese vaccines even before one of them finally received an emergency use authorization from our FDA. And the China factor also in terms of the economy, not just speaking about the Philippine offshore gaming operations or POGO, but also all the lush but still unfulfilled promises, mere pledges, nothing downloaded in terms of promised Chinese investments in their Belt and Road Initiative, their new Silk Road for the government centerpiece Build program. So though our minds and our bodies are focused on health and the economy, because of Filipinos' patriotic or nationalist feelings, and unfortunately, but right now well-deserved low trust for China, we can still continue to popularize these issues of the China factor, even in terms of health and the economy, in order to demand upholding of the national interest, even in the elections next year.
Thank you, Madam Senator, Professor, and Jam. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Cedric. Ma'am will allow, I'm going to be reading a reaction from our Consul General from the DFA, who's currently in San Francisco, I believe, Sir Henry Bensurto, who's been listening and who's joined us here. Let me just pick that up. And I'll read his comments and would like you to react, please, if possible. So our Consul General says basically that the strategic objective of China is the conversion of the South China as its sphere of influence more than a sphere of interest, not only as a security buffer zone, but also as one gateway into the Pacific Ocean where it can threaten the US with credibility, morally with lethality and efficacy with its intermediate nuclear missiles launched from its submarines. In this context, China is now consolidating its gains and moving forward in this direction with its presence now slowly being converted into control. And at the same time, I guess, creating a norm or habit where other countries get used to with the presence and exercise of control. If this norm setting continues over a period of time, it could eventually convert the SES and the countries around it as China's sphere of influence to be respected by other powers, something like the Western Hemisphere or the Monroe Doctrine for the US or Crimea for Russia, slowly by consistency, China will engage in this norm-setting actions to gain international political recognition. What do you make of any reaction towards the statement of a Consul General from the DFA? Ma'am.
To Jam and Conjen Bensurto has not only been listening but has actually given us so much material through which we can think and talk about what we're talking about today, because he was part of that historic Philippine team at The Hague, which won us that victory that retired senior associate Justice Carpio said is the single most significant decision so far under the UNCLOS, and granted not just us Filipinos but all peoples, and not just of our region but of the world, the largest area of the global commons in the oceans so far. So maraming salamat po at mabuhay kay Conjen Bensurto. I think what he reminded us of just now is a concrete example of what Dr. Collin mentioned earlier when he talked about China's new Coast Guard law. That law of theirs is meant not to change their behavior. They can easily switch from their, what is it that Dr. Collin also writes about, their so-called white hulls into actual gray hulls. It's not just to put their civilian agency to a military purpose. That law is really to change our behavior in our oceans or parts of the ocean, which China is claiming as all hers. And that's why we distinguish between de jure and de facto. Even if de jure, we have rights in those waters as recognized at The Hague. If de facto, we don't stand up for those every time China violates them, then de facto, she will be seen by other countries and peoples around the world. And eventually that will distort our own consciousness as Filipinos. She will be seen as having the rights in those waters. So that's why we shouldn't let China say where our vessels can go in the South China Sea, in our own exclusive economic zone, and in international waters. We have to stand our ground now. We've already failed to do so for too long, in too many ways in the last half decade. We have to stand our ground, or our ocean, because if we don't, she will keep on taking and taking if we keep on allowing her. We need to do all and maybe perhaps more of the possible actions that we've talked about so far in this forum in order to stop her in her tracks. And in fact, especially with the ASEAN and hopefully with the Quad and the other naval powers, push her back to where her own territory is, out of fairness and justice to the other countries in these parts of the ocean.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to respond briefly on that. It is correct to look at the South China Sea from these, much more holistic way. That it's not just about simply sovereignty and rights, but it's also about creating a dominion of influence. If anything, the Chinese themselves weren't the ones who created the term island chain. They actually, took the cue from Western writings about island chain, and we are specifically talking about the first island chain that actually comes right down from the Northeast Asia, right down to Southeast Asia. If anything, along the first island chain, Northeast Asia portion is a relatively strong area that China will face pretty tough resistance, largely because of established alliances and taking into account that Northeast Asian alliances of the US, such as Japan and South Korea, even Taiwan, they actually mastered, pretty significant strength against China. But in Southeast Asia, the Southeast Asia portion, the first island chain, is weaker by comparison, and therefore a pretty fertile ground for China to try to create that influence within its dominion. And that, given, as an established fact, I think one way for us to deal with China's attempt to try to normalize the situation in the South China Sea to its favor is to do a few things. One is to constantly remind everybody that the South China Sea is an international medium, such that it is an international medium that has existed for a long time, even before China started to build the artificial islands. It has been a norm that extra-regional powers such as the US, Australia, Japan, India have been so well involved in the South China Sea. And we have to push back any attempt by China to try to create its own exclusive dominion within the South China Sea. And I believe within the talks on the code of conduct, I think there has been some pushback against China's proposal, such as, for example, seeking de facto permission for conducting joint exercises with extra-regional powers or conducting energy exploration. I think there has been a pushback against China. What we need now is we should continue to welcome and encourage international involvement in the South China Sea. That is China's greatest fear, is to internationalize the South China Sea dispute. But right now, given the current situation in the South China Sea, internationalizing the South China Sea is the way to go. I mean, the way I see it is probably the only way to prevent China from going beyond what it's currently doing and to ensure a modicum of peace and stability in the area, and to allow ASEAN countries to gain enough strength to one day be able to push back on its own individually or collectively. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. We'll now call Jim Gomez of Associated Press to ask the next question. Jim, are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me? Jam.
Yeah. Hi, Jim. Good morning.
Hi, Jam. Thank you. Good morning, Senator Risa and Dr. Collin. I just have a quick question. I don't know what geopolitical template or approach can be regarded as effective in relation to China's mindset, policy, and behavior in the South China Sea. There are rules of the game, UNCLOS, the 2016 arbitration ruling, but China has been seen as dismissing them. So in that context, I want to ask you, how would you characterize President Duterte's policy in the South China Sea? If it's faulty, how can it be redirected? If it's weak, how can it be strengthened? If it's wise, how can it be bolstered? Yeah, to both of you.
It's very unwise, but it's not foolish because it's deliberate. And that's even worse. Speaking as a Filipino citizen, as a constituent of this president, it is worse. It is not foolish, but it is deliberately taking a weaker position than we should. It is weak, yes, deliberately so, vis-a-vis China. And your first adjective, is it faulty? Oh, it's very faulty from the get-go, from the principle. Justice Carpio has also written columns about giving aid and comfort to the enemy. Unfortunately, a few other officials have spoken, or some other officials have spoken in that same spirit. And that is not at all demonstrating loyalty to our country. That's just to be polite in this forum, that is a step before outright treason. Is it appeasement? I mean, that became a bad word even in World War II. Appeasement toward Germany by some other European powers. Is it collaboration, as became a bad word during World War II here in the Philippines, vis-a-vis the then imperial wannabe? So it is much more than disappointing, coming as a policy and a practice from our chief executive and the chief architect of our foreign policy. There's nothing good I can say about it right now because we are well mandated by our own constitution and then by that historic victory at The Hague to take a much different, better, and more beneficial policy position vis-a-vis China in the West Philippine Sea. So let's not grab defeat from the jaws of victory. Let us continue to uphold our victory at The Hague. Let us, as loyal Filipino citizens and even government officials, uphold and not betray our own constitution.
Dr. Collin, please. Yeah. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jim, for the question. And it sort of reminded me that when President Duterte talks about an independent foreign policy, I always believe that that is the right way to go, right? I mean, an independent foreign policy is always something that every sovereign nation will pursue. Nobody wants to be seen as a vassal of anyone, right? And even within an alliance, you don't want to be seen as playing just a second fiddle. You want to be seen as an equal partner or an equal ally in the alliance. What I saw as a problem is to pursue an independent foreign policy, there is a need to have principles, right? That, being principled in order to pursue an independent foreign policy, and to some extent, it requires sometimes or most of the time taking a consistent stance towards issues. What I felt as a misstep that was taken, looking at it as an outsider, is when Duterte became president in 2016. One of the first things he had done could have been amounted to a series of missteps. One is to nullify the effect of the 2016 arbitral award on the South China Sea. And that is the first thing. And the second is, amongst the various state visits that he would embark upon, the first one he undertook was to Beijing. And altogether, it would have amounted to a pretty wrong signal to Beijing that the Philippines is willing to forego its gains in the 2016 award, and the president is willing to pursue animal ties with China at all costs in pursuit of the independent foreign policy. And the other thing that I thought was another misstep has been a series of policy measures that scrap some of the key exercises with the US military, for example, scrapping Karat exercise and replacing it with MTA Sama-Sama, for example, scrapping the amphibious landing exercise and replacing it with Commanda exercise, and even imposing geographical restrictions as to where those exercises could be conducted. I think all these could give another wrong signal to China that Duterte isn't willing to further or to maintain the alliance with the US, and thereby it could have somewhat contributed in emboldening Beijing's behavior. So I think one way to do that, to sort of reverse the situation, is precisely to revisit these policies and to try to reverse them back to its original position that could have sent possibly a stronger signal to Beijing later. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jim, do you have a follow-up question?
I'm good, Jam. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now allow Risa to ask a question. Briefly, before I do that, Risa. Okay, go ahead, Risa. I will read that later. Risa has a question, I think, for Senator Risa.
Yes,
Risa, are you there?
Senator, I'd like to, if you have talked to Senator Coco Pimentel, who happens to be the Foreign Policy Senate Committee Chairman and a senior PDP Laban member, and what did he say? Has he tabled your resolution? Second, my question is for you and also Dr. Koh. Do you think that there is possibly a so-called Manchurian candidate in
I think you missed the last part, but I think you were able to hear the gist of the questions of Risa. Senator, would you like to go ahead?
Well, there are theories that there were or was or were already some um, Manchurian candidates in 2016, but people are thinking about that even more and with less humor now in the run up to 2022 because of how unfortunately useful a piece the Philippines has been so far in China's imperial ambitions in the region and beyond. So it's really a formidable prospect that those of us, I don't think not only in the opposition, but any and all parties and candidates who want to pursue a genuine independent or interdependent foreign policy that Dr. Colin mentioned earlier, which is, I think, by nature, therefore, a multinodal or multipolar foreign policy and not shifting from one special relationship of the past to another one, leaving the old ones behind and neglecting to cultivate those that have become or who which were already important and are becoming even more important now altogether. The first part of the question, sorry, uh, Jam, was before the one about the
Liza, would
Manchurian
you like to repeat? Yeah, because there was
candidate.
also a
Sorry,
gap.
Liza. It was related, but the particular focus,
Risa, would you like to repeat your question?
just the first part, please.
From Risa anymore.
Sorry. Well, yes.
Go ahead, ma'am.
So, and so we're concerned about uh, uh, pro-administration social media operations, which growing evidence would show are linked not only with Russia, but also with China. And then, these would be reminiscent of Beijing's systematic misinformation campaigns. Oh, I'm so sorry. I see pre-senior moment forgot the first half of Rice's question. It was related to the Manchurian candidate. Maybe
We'll allow, we'll allow Dr. Collin to react. Do you think though that because we missed the first part of her question, let's answer first this fear of different groups that there may be another Manchurian candidate in the Philippines in 2022. And is it like a scenario that has also happened in several parts in other countries?
So thank you. Probably not so much to say as a Manchurian candidate, but I think in democratic societies with free elections, and when there were instances where there isn't sufficient or adequate legislation that could actually have certain restrictions on foreign donations to political causes in the country, that's where we have those gaps that could be exploited by foreign parties who are trying to meddle in election and trying to sort of manipulate politics in the country. And be that as it may, you call that a Manchurian candidate, or the fact that many countries, great powers, they will try to cultivate influence upon what they saw as likely rising elites within those target countries. China not excluded from that. I mean, China has been doing that for I would say centuries, right? I mean, even when it comes to manipulating, its peripheral kingdoms, even Korea back then, for example. So not unique per se, not strange for China to do that. I wouldn't call that a Manchurian candidate, but probably what China might be looking for is to try to shape that particular candidate to be at least paying some attention to his interests and trying to undermine them. Because when I talk about Manchurian candidate, is usually somebody who is, a loyalist to China, and he's planted, right there, and he will just simply forward China's foreign policy and not the country's foreign policy in that regard. So I think the risk is, is there, but we have to be aware that there are there are structural enablers that actually allow that to happen. So one way to prevent that is to revisit, existing legislation and existing mechanisms, including even, measures that could tackle, misinformation on the social media. I think all these will be very instrumental in ensuring that the election going forward is fair and it is impartial. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Colin. I
Jam,
think
I remember now
Oh,
Risa's first
sige po,
question.
ma'am. Sige po.
Sorry, it was not directly related. She was asking what's the parliamentary status of the resolutions in
Yes,
Senco.
the one of Senator Kiko. Yes.
Sencoco Pimentel, actually. One of the resolutions, I believe the one on demanding payment, compensation from China for her destruction of marine resources in the West Philippine Sea, has been referred to the committee but is still pending. So I will need to follow him up. He has scheduled for hearing other foreign relations resolutions. So I'm hopeful that he will do the same for this. The other resolution on investigating if there were Filipinos who colluded with China in constructing the artificial islands is actually referred to the Committee on National Defense. So with Chairman Senator Ping, and he has also raised critical points quite often on this matter of engaging China in the West Philippine Sea. So I will also follow him up, and I'm hopeful that he will schedule a hearing. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're down to our last two questions before we wrap. I mean, we're like almost 2 hours already with our forum. It's been followed closely also on Facebook. We'd like to hear again from Cedric and then Dreo, and then we'll wrap this forum now already. Cedric, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Jam. With the indulgence of Senator Risa, I'd like to press ma'am on the upcoming elections. So during the debates leading to 2016 elections, we all know that famous or infamous for that matter, jet ski soundbite from then Mayor Duterte, and then he won. So not to trivialize the issue, how will the opposition present or approach the China question to make it, say, palatable to voters?
First, Cedric, I think it is already palatable. Perhaps coming second to our health, our urgent health and economic concerns. But on some days, maybe a stronger second than we think. Even now, we are already proposing concrete actions like our Navy and Coast Guard escorting our fisher folk to their traditional fishing grounds in order to protect them from harassment by China's Coast Guard or even PLA Navy. And the armed forces and the Coast Guard have on more and more occasions shown their willingness to consider or to conduct such action. So the opposition won't even need to promise stunts like jet skiing to our islands and then not fulfilling them, because even now there are very concrete actions that we can ask from our uniformed services and even our civilian agencies like the Coast Guard to do in aid of our fisher folk and as part of projecting again our rights in those parts of the oceans. And leading up to the campaign and the elections, I think it's not only the opposition, but more and more Filipinos of whatever political belief or no political belief, but who as Filipinos are concerned that we be treated with respect by other countries and that we stand up for our national interests with self-respect. I think this is a concern that will cross boundaries of whatever partisan boundaries, whatever colors or no colors of different Filipino groups. This is China and how to engage her properly in our own parts of the ocean, I think is a place where we can find common ground or common water among more and more Filipinos as we move into 2022.
Thank you, ma'am, and good morning.
Cedric. Dreo.
Hi, this is for Dr. Collin. So just like to ask about the Chinese Navy's presence there, the recent incident where they chased down a civilian vessel with TV news crew, our TV news crew there. What is China trying to do in doing this? I mean, Senator Hontiveros mentioned in her opening remarks that it is a signal that they are ready to escalate things. Do you agree? And also, I'm asking this. I mean, is this the plan all along, or is this a new way of dealing with things? Because I remember in 2012, when the Scarborough Shoal standoff started, they went to Scarborough because a Philippine Navy ship responded to Chinese fishing vessels there. And now they're doing the same thing. So I mean, they're sending their navy there for civilian to go after civilian ships. So I mean, those two questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Drill. That actually leads me to give a brief background of what is going on for better understanding. For context, is that ever since the Chinese consolidated their disparate Coast Guard agencies to form Coast Guard in 2013 onwards, is they have been complaining about a few things internally. And one of the things they talked about is that even though they are trying to put forward, the Coast Guard on the front line, but very often in the South China Sea, they confront rival navies. This is not, in deliberate design against the Chinese, because, for many decades in Southeast Asia, navies have always been the stronger maritime institution that performs sovereignty assertion and performs fishery protection. So it's not strange for Southeast Asia, but the Chinese regarded it as disadvantageous for them. So if you recall back in 2018 May, they conducted their first joint patrol that involves the Navy, the Coast Guard, and the local Sansha administration of paracels, where they tried out a new method to try to deal with a multitude of challenges, including foreign navies, which they are very concerned about. So the Coast Guard, if they encounter foreign navy, the PLA Navy will step in. So that has been an established pattern of joint patrol they have. And we initially thought it's restricted to the Paracel Islands, but very clearly, it has started to spread eastward and southward into the Spratly Islands. If you recall back in 2019, the inquiry report actually carried back then in June, that the Chinese Navy was actually actively patrolling around Scarborough Shoal together with the Coast Guard. And if you recall, a few months later in 2019, there was a harassment of a Philippine crude tanker through the area. And one of the voices that came out through the radio identified itself as a naval warship, even though there was no AIS signal that was transmitted. But there's every reason to believe that it may well come from a PLA Navy ship besides the Coast Guard vessel. So we're not actually seeing a new pattern here. That happened with the ABS-CBN crew being harassed. It has been an established pattern of behavior at least since 2018, where those joint patrols were undergoing. And what we saw in today's context is that the Chinese were stepping up in terms of their activity and their aggressiveness in pursuing what they want to do in the South China Sea with these joint patrol format. Yeah, so that's just my response to what you asked. Thank you, Drill.
Thank you.
Senator, you've answered. Jerry, you're good. Okay, all right. I think we're ready to wrap. I would just like to read a reaction actually from one of our observers who's here. Just a quick reaction to Melo's question about the two elephants fighting before I wrap. Basically, the two elephants fighting, it's the grass that suffers. Can you please give this comment? That is where the global framework on international norms come in. After World War II, international human rights law became the global mandate that pushed for the collective consensus, like the Nuremberg trials, etc. These norms must be used to enforce behavior where China has violated member of UNCLOS. It is a battle of brinkmanship that can be attained by the smaller countries backed by these international norms on rule of law. Lots of comments from members of the diplomatic community as well. We have, once again, members of the Philippine military who are here from the north to south, the Marine Battalion, the MBL-10. They've been listening this whole time. And as closing, I would just like to ask our two speakers who've been very generous with their time as their closing remarks. We go back to the Whitson Reef issue, basically. As your closing statement or remark, what do you think then will be the best way forward in the Whitson Reef standoff? I mean, this is essentially a standoff. It's been going on for weeks. Tell us what. Who would like to go first? Senator, would you like to go first?
All right, Jam. Eventually, we have to either push China's ships out of Whitson Reef or compel her to pull them out of her own accord. Obviously, that will take some time. But even now, if we can individually as the Philippines, and hopefully more and more together with like-minded countries within the ASEAN, as Dr. Collins said, and hopefully eventually the whole ASEAN, plus the Quad and other naval powers around the world, if we can even now continue to state our position against this, well, virtual invasion and occupation of Whitson Reef, while we are working on building diplomatic and political muscle to compel her to pull out or to somehow effect a change of policy in her mind, even if just for tactical reasons, if just for now, to pull her ships out of Whitson Reef. And in addition to building that more unities within the community of nations in our region and around the world, let's come up with this again individually or more collectively to project and enforce our environmental and fisheries laws, not just the Philippines' laws, but those of other ASEAN member countries as well, and maybe eventually the Quad and the other naval powers. But taking to heart what Justice Carpio said, that that arbitral ruling gave the whole world the largest area of global commons thus far in the ocean. So it was a victory not just for Filipinos, but for other peoples in the region and around the world. Can our environmental movements, can our different fisher folk organizations and federations work together, and we support them in a kind of people-to-people initiative or initiatives, while we are individually still I was about to say compelling, convincing our individual governments to work more along these lines. And so yes, to ensure that our environmental and fisheries laws are enforced in Whitson, while we're building up the different capacities to change what China has done there, boots on the ground or in the water, and make her pull her ships out of our reef. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. I just want to quickly add on to what Senator Risa has said. I think very often we are presented with a binary choice. One is to resolve a situation like Whitson, we have to go to war, or we have to accept the situation. That ought not to be the situation that could be presented and accepted as a reality or not. There's a third way. A third way is that nobody needs to go to war. At the same time, nobody needs to accept the situation as it is. And one way to do that is perhaps to signal more resolutely to Beijing that there is resolve in trying to address this situation decisively. One way to do that, I think, going beyond just putting out joint statements of the phone calls between the US and Philippine top decision makers, I think it's necessary to signal more determinedly. For example, concrete steps undertaken with regard to the visiting forces agreement. I think this is going to send a much stronger statement to Beijing that the Philippines means business, and of course reversing some of the policies that were being enacted in 2016 in the early days of the Duterte administration, such as reinstating some exercises or expanding some existing exercises to even include them, to areas of interest in the South China Sea in particular. That could send a stronger signal. And my prognosis is that China will eventually pull out its ships. Reef, this time around, there is way much more international attention and criticism on what China is doing. So for now, China may pull out, but I think going forward, it's important to look at, the government's strategic communications. It has to be coherent. At the same time, it has to be properly coordinated with ground actions such as, consistent maritime patrols and surveillance in these areas of interest to ensure that even if the Chinese pull out, they won't come back in the future. So I think it requires what I would see as a whole of government, whole of nation approach. Together, it has to be coherent to send such a signal to a big country like China that has always been able to boast about its unity of actions amongst its government apparatus. So with that, I end my final remark. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Collin, Senator Risa. On that note, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us here. It's been over 2 hours. I'd like to thank former Ambassador Wilfredo Villacorta, who used to be also a senior official of the ASEAN. He's been listening the whole time. Of course, our own Consul General Henry Benso is here. Former CHR Commissioner Eta Rosales is also here. Of course, Colonel Zagalo of the Philippine Army, and many of the members of the Marines, General Bileran, MPLT 10th Fourth Marine Brigade, many members of the diplomatic community, and of course, Mr. Dindo Manhitu of ADR's chat-based group is also here. Thank you very much also to Thomas Weersing of the EU delegation who's joined us once again. Maraming salamat din po sa members ng FOCAP natin for joining us, for attending, and also members of the local press. Thanks so much. We will upload this entire session on our FOCAP.ph page. And we look forward to hearing from you again. Thank you so much for joining us. Senator Risa, stay safe. And thank you for being here. And Dr. Collin Koh, we hope to have you again soon.
Thank you. Take care. Stay healthy.
Take care everybody.
Dr. Collin, maraming salamat sa lahat.
See you, Senator Risa.